How's it going, folks? You are very welcome to part two of the Vietnam War. Okay, so just before we start part two, just a quick little recap. Okay, so we know North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was a democracy. Okay, and what did America want? America did not want the communist North to spread down and take over the communist South. Okay, so America was really afraid of communism. If you look at the picture on the bottom right hand side, America believed in what was called the domino theory. Okay, that if countries in Southeast Asia, Korea, Vietnam fell to communism, then all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism as well. Okay, so Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. And if you look at the map above that picture, guys, you can see how Laos and Cambodia are on the border with Vietnam. So it's very, very possible they would become engulfed by communism if South Vietnam did as well. Okay, now at first, US intervention was through the means of providing weapons and training to the South Vietnamese army, okay? But it soon became very apparent that the South Vietnamese army was inadequate and was not going to be able to fight off the North Vietnamese communists by themselves, okay? So what did America do? America said, right lads, we have to enter this war ourselves, okay? Now, to get a justifiable reason for entering the war, what did they do? They fabricated something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, okay? If you want to look up there, guys, the Gulf of Tonkin is up around, see up there around North Vietnam, to the right of North Vietnam, beside China as well, okay? And what they said is, we had boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, and these boats were attacked by North Vietnamese communists, okay? Now, this was untrue. This never happened, but America made it up. And what did it do? That gave America a justifiable reason for declaring war in Vietnam and entering Vietnam, okay? If you even look up at the Gulf of Tonkin there, you kind of wonder, what were American warships doing there anyway? Because North Vietnam was communist and China was also communist as well. Okay, so it's kind of like America kind of looking for trouble by even being up there in the first place. Okay, now quick little recap on what it was like to fight in the Vietnam War. Okay, so at this stage, guys, we're in about 1965 here. There's a large U.S. military presence in Vietnam. Okay. And the US military was considered the most powerful in the world. Okay, and the US soldiers going to Vietnam believed that the Vietnam War would be over within a matter of months. That they would, that these North Vietnamese guerrilla fighters were no match for the might of the US military. But this proved to not be the case, okay? Because the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, were expert guerrilla fighters, okay? And as we've already said, the Americans had no answer to this type of warfare. No amount of bombing and tanks and artillery could root out North Vietnamese communist forces, okay? Why? Because they were clever. They used to use the terrain around them really well, okay? They fought in the jungle. They would attack American troops and then hide, okay? They dug, if you look at the picture in the bottom left, they had an underground tunnel network which they would hide in as well. Hide from American forces. They could spring up and attack and then hide again. It was very much hit and run tactics. And this made it extremely difficult for the US Army to fight them. Okay, so the US military was kind of a military that was designed to fight like in kind of a war maybe in Europe, like World War II. Okay, you had tanks and planes. It wasn't designed to fight in really dense jungles. Okay, so this frustration at trying to fight guerrilla fighters that most US soldiers never even got to see the guys that were shooting at them led to America to come up with something called Agent Orange. And Agent Orange was a highly, highly controversial thing that the US military started doing. Okay, so as you've already said, guys, where did the North Vietnamese forces hide? Well, they hid in the jungles, they hid in underground tunnels. So the jungles were the primary kind of hiding place, okay? It was impossible for Americans from the air to see where these North Vietnamese military bases were. So what did they do? They decided to spray special weed killer called Agent Orange on the forests of North Vietnam. And what did this do? This basically killed the trees in the North Vietnamese jungles, okay? Over 6 million acres of crops were destroyed, and many Vietnamese people were poisoned in the process. Okay, so like they're literally dropping pesticide from planes. So naturally enough, humans are going to be affected. And again, that comes back to this thing about the Vietnamese civilians. They bore the brunt of this conflict. They suffered the very most. Okay, why was it called Agent Orange? Simply because of its color. Okay, and if you look at a picture there, that's a picture of a plane dropping this orange weed killer or pesticide, whatever you want to call it. Why are they doing this? They were doing this to destroy the jungles which the North Vietnamese troops hid in. Okay, but as well as destroying jungles, guys, they destroyed very important crops and other things that people needed to survive on. Okay. One other long-lasting effect of Agent Orange was that it led to a lot of horrible birth defects. So a lot of pregnant women were affected by the pesticide, okay? And when they had their children, very often their children were born with birth defects. And that was as a result of Agent Orange, okay? So a highly, highly controversial method of fighting the war, okay? Now, America, as we know, the American army had, they thought they'd be in Vietnam for maybe a couple of months and it'd be over. But it turned into a stalemate and they were there for years and years and years, okay? And this led to a collapse of American morale, not just on the front lines, but also at home, okay? So many US soldiers were conscripted from poor white and black neighborhoods, okay? And they felt this is unfair. So there was very few middle and upper class soldiers in the military, okay? So soldiers were conscripted from poorer areas, okay? So the word conscription means you have to join the military, okay? 1/3 of US troops took drugs, okay? Now, why they take drugs? They took drugs very often to kind of deal with the horrors of war, to deal with the horror of the war they are fighting in, okay? To deal with this, being attacked every day and seeing dead bodies every day, okay? Many troops deserted. Many troops just simply got up and left, okay? They walked off, okay? And also, some troops carried out horrible massacres against Vietnamese villages. For example, the My Lai massacre, okay? And what this was, guys, was basically US troops went into a village and, they believed the village had North Vietnamese Viet Cong soldiers and they ended up killing everybody in the village, okay? And, this was due to a collapse of US morale, of discipline of US soldiers, okay? And that came from the frustration of being stuck in a war that, America didn't believe they should be in the first place, okay? So, it wasn't like in the Second World War where you have, one common evil, Adolf Hitler, and the world was trying to stop him. This was a war that, was not really affecting America in any way. So Americans kind of started to question, why are we even here in the first place, okay? And naturally enough, guys, this view spread to people at home. Okay, so the Vietnam War was kind of the very first war that was televised. Okay, so there was live footage coming from this war, pictures every single day straight from the battlefield, and these were on US news channels and US newspapers. Okay, so American people got a good insight into what was going on. They could see all these horrible massacres, the high death toll, and they kind of sort of began to think, why are we there? Okay, and this was particularly prevalent among young American students. Okay, other notable leaders such as Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali, they spoke out against it. Okay, they spoke out against the war. Why are we over here fighting in this war? Okay, and at the top left we can see a group of US troops who obviously are big supporters of Martin Luther King. Okay, also Democratic Party congressmen also spoke out against the war. So, there was a Democratic Party who entered the war in the first place. So, for them to speak out against it was another huge thing. Their own party was wondering, well, hang on, lads, why are we even here in the first place? Okay, and the war was quite a stalemate. America made no real inroads against the North Vietnamese communists for a long time. Okay, and the stalemate was kind of broke in 1968 by what was called the Tet Offensive. Okay, so up until 1968, American people believed that they were actually winning the war, but the Tet Offensive changed this. Okay, so Tet is like a national holiday in Vietnam. And during this national holiday in 1968, North Vietnamese soldiers snuck down into South Vietnam and they attacked the US embassy in Saigon. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam, okay? And they captured the city of Hue as well. Now, after a few weeks, the US and South Vietnamese had regained control of Saigon and regained control of the American embassy. Okay, and while overall it was seen as a military victory for the US, it was a political nightmare. It was a political disaster. Okay, why? Because as you've already said, guys, the Vietnam War was the first televised war. Okay, and if you want to look at a picture there in the top left, okay, that's a picture from the top of the US embassy in Saigon. And they're US embassy workers trying to scramble onto a helicopter to escape while they're being attacked by North Vietnamese soldiers. And this kind of image was beamed into people's houses in America, and they thought, this is horrible. Our own embassy is being attacked. Our own people are being killed. American civilians are being killed in the embassy. We have to get out of here. Okay. Bottom left there, guys, is a picture of the embassy wall that North Vietnamese Viet Cong they blasted a hole in it to get into it. Okay. So these kind of images shocked Americans, so much so that the current president, Lyndon B. Johnson, did not contest the 1968 election because his reputation was damaged so much by images of the North Vietnamese taking over the US embassy. Now, Richard Nixon now comes into power, okay? And Richard Nixon was kind of, he was more of the idea of reducing America's influence in Vietnam, okay? And this shows how long the war went on for, guys. So, this is the third U.S. president to be running the country while the war is going on in Vietnam, okay? So, newly elected president Richard Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam, okay? So he knew Vietnam is kind of a lost cause. America is not going to do any more there. We should leave, okay? And he had an idea called Vietnamization, okay? And what that was letting the South Vietnamese troops do most or all of the fighting, okay? From 1969 to 1972, he reduced U.S. troop numbers from 500,000 to under 70,000, okay? Despite this, there was still anti-war protests, okay? And some of these anti-war protests turned ugly in America, okay? For example, there were 4 students killed at the University of Kent in May 1970 because America still had troops in Vietnam, okay? The leaking of the Pentagon Papers was also significant because these showed that the previous president, Lyndon B. Johnson, had lied to the American public and to the American Congress about how the war was going. So he basically said to the American people, oh lads, the war's going great, we're about to win here, we're about to kick the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam and defeat communism. When in reality, that was not the case. Okay, and again, these kind of created a distrust around the US government, okay? If you look at the picture there, guys, at the bottom left, Vietnamization, okay? So that was, if you see there, that's a South Vietnamese soldier, and it's got like a wind-up thing in its back, and the idea there is that, the South Vietnamese army was no good, and you literally had to stand there and wind them up to get them to do any fighting, okay? Finally, by 1973, the Vietnam War ends, okay? So America had been in Vietnam for about 8 years, okay? So it was probably the longest modern war America had ever fought in, okay? So Richard Nixon, he wanted to negotiate with the North Vietnamese, okay? So he said to the North Vietnamese, right lads, look, we have to do something here because we've been fighting you for 8 years, and then you've been fighting even longer. Let's do something, okay? Now, initially, the North Vietnamese refused, okay? So what did Nixon do? Richard Nixon said, right, we're going to start bombing you again. And he organized Operation Linebacker, which was the US bombing of North Vietnamese cities, okay? As a result, the North Vietnamese government said, okay, right, listen, fair enough, we'll negotiate. We don't want to go into another war with America, okay? So in January 1973, both sides signed a ceasefire, okay? And there was a couple of terms to this. The first term was that all American prisoners would be returned to America, and the second term was that America agreed to completely withdraw and leave Vietnam within 60 days, okay? Now, what do you think was going to happen when American forces left Vietnam? Okay, surprise, surprise, the North Vietnamese were going to invade the South, and that's exactly what happened, guys. Okay, so as soon as the US left Vietnam, the North Vietnamese communist forces came into the South and took over South Vietnam, and this just made Vietnam one entire country, okay? So Saigon fell in South Vietnam. Saigon fell on April 30th, and this was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Remember, guys, Ho Chi Minh is the North Vietnamese communist leader, okay? And guys, at the time, this was seen as like a relief for the people of Saigon. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, Saigon gives in with a sigh of relief. Viet Cong promised a policy of peace, okay? So this is the idea here, guys, is that, despite the fact that South Vietnam was now communist, the South Vietnamese people were happy because the war was finally over. Okay, the war was finally over. The violence was finally going to stop. Okay. Now, the results of the war. So, as you can tell, the Vietnam War was not a success for the US. Okay, it was America's longest war. 58,000 US soldiers were killed, as well as 2.3 million Vietnamese. So, that's nearly half the Irish population worth of Vietnam people were killed. And a lot of those people were civilians as well, okay? The war cost the US $110 billion and damaged the US economy. Okay, as we know, in 1975, all of Vietnam was reunited under communist rule, and communists then gained control in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Okay, so that's really interesting, guys. Okay, so it was basically like nearly a waste of time. Okay, because if we go back to this slide here, okay, we can see here the domino theory: Vietnam. If we stop Vietnam from falling to communism, then we'll save Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Okay, but in reality, when Vietnam fell, so did Cambodia and so did Laos. As soon as America withdrew, all those countries fell to communism. Okay, Americans were very divided on the war. Support for the Democratic Party fell, and people began to distrust their government. Okay, so this war, like, not only it damaged the American economy, it, obviously a lot of American troops were killed, and obviously it didn't stop the spread of communism. It just delayed it. It didn't really stop the spread of communism. Okay, look at an interesting picture of the soldier on your right here. He's got written on his jacket, "Caution, Vietnam may be hazardous to your health," and on his helmet he has written, "Just you and me, right, Lord?" As if, the only person he has protecting him is Jesus Christ. Okay, folks, thanks very much for watching. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to drop me a message on the page. Thank you.